If you clicked on this, you probably have the urge to fix something, maybe in your community or maybe in the country itself. You might be already working inside civic systems and have been for years, or perhaps you're just starting to think about how you could create change around something that matters to you. Either way, you're what I call an American civic builder. Someone who realizes that they have power and decides to use it, whether that's in starting a program, doing something to fix healthcare, education, joining a nonprofit board, working in government, investing in a cause, or solving any problem in our public lives. But here's what you've probably discovered. The minute you start down that path, you immediately hit a wall. You come up against 50 different agencies, federal, state, local, all taxing, spending, and regulating. You've got interest groups, nonprofits, funders, all speaking different languages, different regimes, state to state, city to city, even inside one metro area. Everybody's in charge and nobody is, and you can't figure out where to even start. If you're just jumping in, it's very easy to think anything involving government in this country is irretrievably broken. There's no way to change this mess. And if you've been working in it for years, you might feel that feeling even stronger. It all feels impossible to change. And it's not wrong that you feel that way. It's a heck of a lot harder to transform things that already exist than to build them from scratch for the first time. But what if I told you that change is possible, and it's more important than ever that we try? What if this complexity and chaos is the direct result of America's deepest constitutional values? Values that were designed to protect individual liberty, prevent tyranny, and keep power close to the people. And it's up to us to learn how to work with all of this, especially in our local communities. I'm Annalisa, an attorney who spent 20 years inside government, nonprofits, and philanthropy. I've run a $300 million federal housing program. I've led grant making at a charitable foundation. And I've seen what separates communities that solve social sector problems from those that stay stuck. In this 3-part series, I'm going to show you how America's civic systems actually work, why they're designed this way, how to harness the power to change them, and a cautionary tale about what happens when you don't. If you're a civic builder trying to make change in any area, consider this your roadmap. But even if you're just trying to understand why things feel so broken right now and what can be done about it, stick around. Because the constitutional principles I'm going to take us through might be exactly what we need more of. And it's worth understanding why they were a part of our DNA in the first place. So this is part 1, understanding the terrain. First, let me give you a term for what every civic builder runs into, that problem I talked about at the beginning, where there are just so many layers of government regulations, jurisdictions, that it can just seem impossible to know where to start, let alone move the system in a better direction. I call that thing civic sprawl, a dense, tangled overgrowth of agencies at every level of government, and also the charitable sector, that makes solving community problems ridiculously hard. You see, 250 years after our founding, America has become very, very complicated. And if you've ever tried to fix something in your community, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But why is it like this to begin with? In this video, we're going to zoom all the way out and think about how the United States was actually designed. And this is going to form the backdrop for everything that comes next. Now, if you just want to get right into the strategy part, how am I supposed to get things done, you can feel free to click ahead to the next video. But I think you should understand why the framers set up the country this way. Not only will it make you more effective, but it will actually help you think critically about our founding values and what kind of country we want to build for the future. So let's get into it. So there's this great quote from the world of continuous improvement in manufacturing. Every system is perfectly designed to get the results it's getting. And when we're talking about public services in America, what exactly is the system we're talking about? Well, nothing other than the US Constitution. And you see, civic sprawl isn't an accident. It's the natural outgrowth of a set of core values the framers recognized and built into our Constitution. Individual liberty, decentralized power, state and local control, flexibility to evolve and adapt, and the freedom to assemble or organize. To understand those principles and everything that came after, we've got to understand what the framers were thinking. So let's rewind to the Revolutionary War. The framers were disgusted with their government and willing to fight a war to kick King George to the curb. And they had a lot of strong opinions on what kind of government they wanted and what kind they didn't when they got done with it. So let's just think for a second. What kind of structure makes it easy to organize power and efficiently deploy resources? A monarchy. and they were willing to go to extreme measures to prevent a monarchy from ever happening in this country. The framers did not trust centralized power, and they were trying to do everything they could to prevent power from concentrating in one place. But to understand just how much they valued that, we actually have to look at the story of our first failed constitution. So we spend a lot of time learning about this guy in US history, but did you know that when the US was founded, there was no plan to even have a president? So we had the Declaration of Independence in 1776, and we fought a Revolutionary War. And around that time, the first national government, called the Continental Congress, was set up under this document called the Articles of Confederation. Now let's just say that this was a very loose form of national government. Back then, the states weren't going to agree to anything that would even remotely resemble a monarchy. So there was no president and no executive branch. They agreed to a national government that was so weak it couldn't even tax or regulate trade. All it could do was ask states nicely for money and hope that they felt generous. And after the revolution, the states were out there doing their own thing, printing their own money, which was different state to state, negotiating their own trade deals, and basically acting like 13 little countries. Well, this whole everybody do whatever you want approach, it didn't really work. Things got so chaotic that by 1786, there was this outbreak of violent uprisings known as Shays' Rebellion, in which angry Revolutionary War vets stormed the courthouses in Massachusetts. They were broke and fed up with their state government, which had promised to pay them for their military service in IOUs and never came through. That was the wake-up call. People like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison went, "Oh crap, if we don't get our act together, this whole US experiment is going to collapse." So in 1787, they called for a convention to fix the Articles of Confederation. And that summer, 55 delegates gathered in Philadelphia in a hot, sweaty, stinky room from May to September, 6 days a week, to take a real close look at that thing and see if they could amend it. Now, here's another quote I like from business. Fail fast. And that's exactly what the framers did when they decided to take that Articles of Confederation, chuck it out the window, and start over from scratch. Now, they knew they needed to put in a stronger structure at the federal level. But there was fierce debate about just how much power that federal government should have, which we know because James Madison was secretly taking notes about what everybody said, even though the whole thing was supposed to be done behind closed doors. So on one side, you had Alexander Hamilton. Yeah, that guy. And he was basically like, we need a strong central government to build a legit country. And on the other side, you had folks like Thomas Jefferson, who, even though he wasn't at the convention himself, represented a very different vision. Jefferson believed that real liberty came from town-level government, where citizens could directly participate in governing themselves. He thought if you pushed power too far away from ordinary people, if you made government so big and distant that citizens couldn't actually shape it, you'd lose the thing that made democracy work: active citizenship. His camp really favored local control, town governments, and people coming together to take care of themselves. Not because they hated government, but because they believed self-governance only works at a scale when people can actually participate in it. So who won that debate? Well, it was a draw. Because contrary to what some people think, the Constitution was not actually handed down from on high like the Ten Commandments. This whole constitutional convention was compromise city, including some morally indefensible compromises around slavery that we'll always have to reckon with as a country. But here's one compromise you probably don't remember from history class that's relevant to our civic architecture today. It's the one that locked in one of our core values: state and local control. What I'm actually talking about here is the Massachusetts Compromise, which was all about what power the states and the people are actually giving up to this federal government. Let me break it down like this. The way the Constitution works is that the states are coming together through their delegates to say, hey, we're agreeing to give up some of our power to a federal government because we want to make this nation work. But only the powers that are explicitly listed here, which they do in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. These are called the enumerated powers. And this is what the federal government clearly has the power to do. And you can see all kinds of things spelled out here, many of which were really corrections for what was lacking in our first failed constitution, like the power to tax and the power to regulate commerce. So that seems pretty clear, right? Well, by September 17th, they came down to a final draft and 39 of the 55 delegates signed on. But as soon as the convention ended and the document was published and started to get circulated for ratification in the states, the anti-federalists started screaming in the newspapers about how dangerous it was and why it shouldn't be ratified. So that's when you see the publication of the Federalist Papers in response. This was this huge, famous public campaign of essays about why the Constitution was great and why it should be ratified. You know, it was kind of like Fox News versus CNN of the 1780s. So it was during this time that the framers made a deal to calm everybody down, which was known as the Massachusetts Compromise. And this compromise added to the Constitution the Bill of Rights, and with it the 10th Amendment, which basically says that any power not specifically given to the federal government remains with the states or the people. It's kind of like the states keep all the rest of the powers because it comes from them in the first place, and the federal government isn't supposed to do anything more than what is explicitly listed in those enumerated powers. And it's actually the last sentence in the document, the thing you're most supposed to remember. So it sounds simple enough. The federal government handles all these specific big picture things that are listed, and the states handle all the rest, like schools, police, and roads. State and local folks controlling the things that are closest to our daily lives. Now that seems like it should keep the federal government pretty contained, right? Well, think about some of the federal agencies you're familiar with. How is it the case that we have something like a federal Department of Education? You don't see that listed anywhere here, right? Well, here's the thing. The framers of the Constitution were mostly all lawyers, 34 of the 55 delegates to be specific. And they built some fine print into this thing. Buried in a sort of hard-to-see place is the Necessary and Proper Clause, also known as the Elastic Clause, which basically says, except the Congress can make any law it deems necessary and proper to carry out any of those listed powers. And boom, there's your loophole that lets the federal government sprawl into infinity. But before you shake your head at all those pesky lawyers, keep in mind that the framers did this for a very good reason. The framers knew that to put in place a government that could stand the test of time, the Constitution had to be flexible. It had to be able to evolve and adapt, to be able to deal with challenges the framers couldn't even imagine. And you can find a lot of writings from them explaining their point of view. So there you see that value of ours, the flexibility to evolve, built right into our design. And very early on, you see the new federal government trying stuff that isn't listed, like establishing a national bank. And the Supreme Court is having to get together to decide if it's out of bounds. And because of the Necessary and Proper Clause, they were like, yeah, things like that are okay, because it's implied by the language in the Commerce Clause, one of those listed powers. And you'd need a national bank to carry out commerce. And this pattern has continued for over 200 years. And this is just the same if you were Congress in 1979 trying to justify creating a federal Department of Education. You know, you wouldn't be able to say you had direct authority to do it with any of those enumerated powers. You'd have to say it was implied. Now, which one of these would you guess they invoked? Well, a lot of these federal agencies get created under what's called the Tax and Spend Clause, or the General Welfare Clause. And Congress interpreted providing for the general welfare as allowing the federal government to support and regulate education through funding and programs that are aimed at improving national educational outcomes. And you certainly can't argue with that being an important national interest. And it's also kind of about us putting our collective foot down and going, you know, there's just some things that all American children should have access to, regardless of whether one state agrees or not. And this does really muddy the waters on who really controls what and how money is all tangled up at the federal, state, and local level. And it makes comprehensive reform nearly impossible. But what I really want to talk about is the thing that always gets lost. The fact that all this growth isn't just happening at the federal level. The states are free to set up whatever local jurisdictions they want under their own constitutions and codes. And because the U.S. Constitution explicitly reserves any unlisted powers to the states through the 10th Amendment, and there's no real limit on how many state and local agencies we create, because the federal government isn't really in charge of them, it just shares power with them. We have grown an absolutely staggering quantity of state and local government in this country. On one hand, that's incredible. We have this level of state sovereignty that's unheard of in some other countries, which puts us slightly more on the continuum towards localized, decentralized government. And that's something we ought to remember and value, especially in the face of federal power consolidations. It was all set up this way to prevent tyranny. It's about having multiple power centers that can never concentrate in one place. But it's also the source of civic sprawl, and a sort of never-ending battle or tension about who really controls what. It's our blessing and it's our curse. We have so many state and local government units that we've actually created a census of governments to count them all. So just how many units do you think we have at the state and local level? I'll give you a second to guess. There are over 90,000 governmental units in this country at the state and local levels. And here's how they break down. Besides the 455 federal agencies, we have 50 states, 3,000 counties, over 12,000 school districts, over 30,000 cities and towns, and over 38,000 special purpose units, like water districts and housing authorities, which all cost us around $3 trillion a year. Oh, and of course we cannot forget the 574 federally recognized Indian tribes. In the words of Harvard professor David King, for a country that founded itself on a distrust of government, we've utterly surrounded ourselves with it. And I'm just going to show you how they break down in one major metro area, Seattle, Washington. And while we are free to build all this local and state government that we want, we don't often stop and think about changing these structures when they don't really make sense for us anymore. I mean, most of us live in metro areas where we work, shop, and travel across multiple jurisdictions daily. Problems like crime or homelessness don't respect these local little boundaries. In fact, for most things you have to solve for on a regional level, like water use, land use, or transit planning, we actually end up creating whole other nonprofit associations just so that we can coordinate all of our local government agencies and help them talk to each other. We rarely consolidate, even though we have the freedom to, just like Connecticut did when it eliminated counties in 1960. Instead, we usually just keep adding layers. And sometimes that's great because it supports our ability to control ourselves locally, but other times it just leads to a lot of inefficiency. And speaking of nonprofit organizations, civic sprawl gets even more complicated because of another constitutional value: the freedom to assemble, to associate, and to organize, which is sort of broadly implied by the First Amendment, the 10th Amendment, and then later enshrined by Congress in the tax code. But probably nothing makes it as clear as the observations by Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America. You see, back in the 1830s, de Tocqueville toured around and noticed something remarkable about this country. Whenever there was a problem to solve, Americans didn't wait for government permission. They just got together and solved it. He wrote, "Where in France you would find the government, in the United States you are sure to find an association." And what did he mean by that? Churches, charities, interest groups. Fast forward to today, where we have over 2 million nonprofit organizations, one for every 165 Americans. Some of them that are out there actually adding to our pot, like the foundations that make charitable grants, others out there raising money from private donors, and some of them spending tax dollars because they get grants and contracts from the government to deliver services. They're not replacing government, they're filling niches, testing innovations, addressing needs that large bureaucracies can miss. In a way, it's kind of like in the original vision, American government was designed to work more like a platform that enables countless individual actors, groups, and local jurisdictions to build solutions on top of it. But what this means for civic builders now is that when you're trying to tackle something like homelessness, you're not coordinating just the major government agencies, the federal, state, and local levels that hold most of the resources, but also possibly 100 plus nonprofits, foundations, and groups, each controlled by a different board. And there is no top-down force mandating they all efficiently coordinate with each other. No, just like the framers did, you've got to get them all to agree. So given all this complexity, 90,000 government units, 2 million nonprofit organizations, overlapping authority at every level, what separates folks that solve civic problems from those that stay stuck? Well, it means that when you want to change something for real, you need a strategy. Power in the US is fractured into a million tiny slices, including a heck of a lot at the state and local level that we often ignore. And it often just shows up looking like civic sprawl and civic word salad. But instead of getting trapped in the fog, you simply have to identify where all the power sits, who controls what resources, and then figure out how to gather enough of it to actually get something done. It's possible to do, we just never talk about how. Some communities with the same constitutional structure, same civic sprawl, create real transformations, not just because they're inherently better at collaborating and singing Kumbaya, but because they understand how power and money actually works at the state, local, and federal level. And a critical mass of American civic builders in those places know how to gather that dispersed power and wield it strategically. You'll get to see an example of that in the next video in the series, and you'll see exactly how Milwaukee pulled up something amazing and reduced chronic homelessness by 92% from 2015 to 2020. They didn't need more money. They needed to organize who controlled the money they already had and gather those dispersed resources under one structure that could actually deploy a solution. Another city, which we'll examine in part 3, didn't. And things got worse despite massive investment. So in the next video, where we talk about Milwaukee's success, I'm also going to give you a 3-step framework that will show you exactly how you can work with these forces and not against them. You can use this framework to change whatever matters to you in the public arena, whether that's housing, education, infrastructure, anything, because you're going to be able to see what others miss. And you'll know where to focus your energy to actually get results. And I hope you try, because here's the thing. The framers designed a system that only works when citizens take responsibility for how power and resources are organized, especially at the local level. If you don't use that power, it's kind of like you lose it. See, we've spent a few generations handing that responsibility upward and outward, to Washington, to political parties, to institutions we hope will solve our problems, to a national media that concentrates mostly on DC. It's like we've become passive consumers of government goods and services rather than active agents in our collective destiny. And that's not what the framers envisioned when they set this whole thing up. That abandonment of our power and agency might be part of the reason why things have gotten as bad as they are. And at a time when power is consolidating in ways the framers never imagined, federal, corporate, technological, understanding how to wield it isn't just about being effective. It's about preserving the constitutional values that make individual liberty and self-governance possible in the first place. So let's learn more about it. So if any of this resonates with you, if you'd just like some strategies to change what matters to you, or if you're just curious to see how Milwaukee took charge of their local civic architecture and almost completely eliminated chronic homelessness, stick around, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in part 2.